We are in for a treat this evening. This is night 2. You have graduated into the second level of this class. You graduated from last night into tonight, and we are entering into some really interesting territory. Tonight's topic is the prophetic timeline, how ancient Babylon predicted the end of the world. Now, if you weren't here last night, we had the framework that was laid for this whole series of masterclass topics. We looked at a really important topic in that last session about a 2,000-year-old prediction about the coming crisis that will face the world. But are we afraid of it, if you were here last night? No, we're not afraid of it, because the person in the story tells us, we're telling you this because it's going to give you hope. And so last night, we looked at this picture of a global world order that was written of 2,000 years ago, and some of the details that were surrounding this are absolutely impossible and improbable for the human mind to assume that this is possibly accurate. And for the last 2,000 years, skeptics and scholars alike have argued that this is improbable, it's impossible. And yet, as we saw last night, we are seeing signs right around us today that these things are becoming not science fiction, not conspiracy, but fact. And so tonight, we lay the next layer of foundation as we explore over these 3 weekends who and what these 3 characters are and how this all plays out. Hence the title, The End Game. Now, I gave you this. Actually, let me test you. How many prophecies are there in the Bible? And if you get this right, I might just give you a Faith FM mug, because I know you all need a mug. So there's a little girl's hand gone up right there. She's the first one. She didn't even wait for the question. If you can tell me, what's your name? Lila? If you can tell me how many prophecies are in the Bible, you will get this mug. Can you tell me? Wow, good job. There is come up the front, if you're allowed to. Yes, all right, come. Congratulations, up here please. You are the first graduate of the Masterclass series. There is your very own Faith FM mug. Okay. Thank you very much. You got a lot to live up to now. So she was correct, and she was listening. There are 1,817 prophecies in the Bible. And last night we looked at 2 of them. And it felt like we could have gone on forever examining just 2 of these predictions. Tonight, we look at another one of these 1,817 prophecies. I want to introduce you to a very infamous character in human history. His name is Kaiser Wilhelm II. He was the Emperor of Germany at the time of World War I. Now, Kaiser Wilhelm, he was approached by the custodians of the Metz Cathedral. Today, the Metz Cathedral is in France, but during World War I, when Emperor Kaiser Wilhelm was in power, this was actually in Germany. The custodians of this cathedral, they had a problem. The roof was leaking and they needed it to be fixed. But in those days, you used to have these patrons who would provide support for the arts and the churches and religion. And so the custodians of the cathedral went to Kaiser Wilhelm and said, Kaiser, we need some funds to fix the roof, and you're the man to do it. Could you please give us the money to fix the roof? Well, Kaiser Wilhelm responded in the most peculiar way, as it's noted in history. He turned to these men who asked for his help and said, in front of your church, you can sort of see it. All the way along here, you can see there's these statues. Can you see those statues? He said, one of those statues is the prophet Daniel. Now, you remember last night we looked at the book of Daniel, that scroll that was written by a man called Daniel. It was one of the favorite books of the Dead Sea Scroll collection. He said, you've got this image of the prophet Daniel on the cathedral. Here's the deal. I will give you the money to fix the roof if you remove the head of Daniel the prophet and you replace it with my head. Now, don't you find that peculiar? Kaiser Wilhelm, the Emperor of Germany, is saying, oh, I'll fix your roof, but get rid of that Daniel's head. Now, it's reported that this is what he said. He said, Daniel's prophecy does not fit with what? My plans. Now, what was prophecy from last night? Prophecy was something written in the past, talking about the future. Kaiser Wilhelm says, what Daniel has written in the past doesn't fit with my plans. And he says, I can't accept that. Where Charlemagne and others have failed, I will succeed. So we're going to explore why on earth would Kaiser Wilhelm, the most powerful person in Germany at the time, why would he be concerned about a dusty old book? Let's go and look at this character, Daniel. Daniel lived around 620 to 538 BC, so 6th century. And he is famous amongst the Dead Sea Scroll collections, which I alluded to last night, which were found in 1948 in the Dead Sea, which is in Qumran, near the sea, or Dead Sea, which is near Jerusalem or Israel. And in the collection of these Dead Sea documents, we find a copy of the book of Daniel, a number of fragments, that dates back to 200 BC. That's a copy. So this is an old book. And we can go through the evidence, and I have a whole other presentation that could take 3 hours that just looks at the evidence supporting that the book of Daniel is a 6th century BC document. Now, this is really important because the skeptics argue that the book of Daniel is a 2nd century AD document. So imagine, here's BC. You know BC AD, right? So this is before Christ, and this is after Christ. This is basically the point of the BC AD, even though Jesus wasn't born in 0 BC. But anyway, roughly this is the story, before Christ, after Christ. So the archaeologists believe that the book of Daniel was written 600 years before Christ. Does that make sense? The copies that we have in the Dead Sea Scroll collection are 200 years before Christ. But the skeptics argue that it's actually 200 years after Christ these books were written. And you know what the number one reason is, according to the biggest skeptics out there about the book of Daniel, is that the accuracy of the predictions is too accurate. But here's the problem. Jesus Christ, the Jewish rabbi, in 27 AD, is quoting from the book of Daniel. So how could the book of Daniel be written after him as an illustration? So this book is fascinating. It's fascinating for 2 reasons. One, it contains historical records which only recently, I'm talking as recent as 2017, are being found to be historically factual. There's still parts of the book that have been disputed up until 2017 that now with archaeological discoveries, we can know for sure that it knew what it was talking about historically. But the second reason this book is fascinating is because it has predictions that aren't about the past, they're about the future and our time coming into the future. And so we're going to explore one of the 1,817 prophecies that does an amazing job of connecting the past with our present and takes us just a little bit beyond. And that's why tonight's topic, this first session, is about the timeline. So the book of Daniel has 12 chapters in the divisions that we have in our Bible today. The first chapter begins with what's called the Babylonian captivity. There was a king called Nebuchadnezzar. He didn't like the Israelites, and so long story short, he captured the northern 10 tribes and then eventually the southern 2 and made it a completely Babylonian territory. He marched those captives across to Babylon, and the rest is history. By the way, interesting point. Since that time, which was around 600 BC, since that time, Israel has never had a king. So this is a very important moment in the history of Israel. So that's chapter 1, and you can read it. It's a very interesting story. But chapter 2 is where we're going to spend our time this evening, because this chapter begins with a story but ends with a prediction. The story is about how Nebuchadnezzar, a number of years have gone by since he captured Israel and brought them to Babylon. And in this story, it starts that he has a disturbing dream. And it says that he wakes up from that dream and he can't remember the dream, and he is really, really stressed out of his mind. Now, recently I was in the British Museum, and there's an entire section on the top floor that has Mesopotamian artifacts. So Mesopotamia is the cradle of civilization, where Babylon was, and Iran is today, and Iraq is today. And we have discovered in the archaeological space numerous clay tablets called dream omen tablets. An omen is a sign, and the dream is a dream. So it's dreams about signs. And what we have discovered by understanding the cuneiform, which is this crazy-looking language written along these stones, is that the Babylonians believed that the dreams were from the gods. And so when you received a dream, it meant the gods were trying to communicate with you. And being the king, the gods communicated with the king through dreams. So in chapter 2 of Daniel, it begins with this story that Nebuchadnezzar has a dream, which he understood to be what? A message from the gods. And he wakes up and he can't remember it. What kind of loser are you as a king? You get a message from the gods and you can't even remember it. So he panics and he calls for the advisors, the magicians, the astrologers. He calls them into his chambers. We don't know what time of night, but it was in the nighttime at some point. They come rushing in, and the king says, "Guys, I've had a dream. I need you to tell me what I dreamt and tell me what it meant." Now, these guys, the astrologers and the soothsayers, we have numerous artifacts now, and we know what they used to do. What they would do is they would say to the person that had the dream, "Hey, what was the dream that you had?" And they'd say, "I went to bed and there was a great field and there was a flower that popped up in the field," or whatever the story was. And they'd say, "Well, thank you very much. Now come over here, put your hand on this beast," whether it was an ox or a ram or something, and they would do some chanting, and then they would sacrifice the animal, I don't know if you like gory details, but they would take out the liver, and they would get the liver fresh out of the sacrifice, get a clay tablet that was already made in the shape of a liver, and they would compare parts of the clay liver to the fresh liver, and that would be the answer for the king. And so they would take what he said and said, "This is not good, go left. This is good, go right," whatever the case may be. So these astrologers and magicians were very accustomed to essentially making up stories based on interpreting a sacrifice to a piece of clay. Now, the problem in this story is that apparently, up until this time, they had never been asked to explain what the dream was that a king had. Sorry, not to explain it, but to tell him what he dreamt, but only to explain it. Now, I have perfected this art over the years, and I am able to interpret any dream you give me. Let's test it out. Give me a dream. Make it G-rated, please. Give me a dream. Someone shout out a dream. Okay, I'll give you one. I know what you dreamt. Are you ready? He had a dream. He was in a deserted place, and there was rivers flowing this way and that way, and he didn't know which way to go. And then he woke up. I'll tell you what he dreamt, what it meant. He's very confused. Very confused. You get what I'm doing, right? I'm being facetious here. You tell me anything you dreamt, I can make up a good meaning out of it. I have the art of storytelling. And so these guys were experts at doing that. But never before had they been asked to tell a king what he had dreamt. So they turned to him. And by the way, here's one of the astrology charts that we've discovered. It's in the British Museum as well. Sorry, this one's in London, in the Louvre. Not London, Paris. I've just been to all these places just recently, sorry. in the Louvre, you can go there and see examples of this. There are examples in the British Museum as well. But the point is that these guys were very, very good at taking a story, a dream, and turning it into an action that you have to take because the gods have told you so. But in this case, they couldn't do it. And they actually are recorded there in Daniel chapter 2 saying, no king has ever asked us to do what you're asking us to do. So Nebuchadnezzar seems a little bit, bit bipolar. And he goes from asking them for help to saying, you don't help me, I'm going to kill you. And in fact, this is what he describes. It says, I will turn you into a dead pile of bones, basically, and then I'm going to go and kill your family, and I'm going to burn your house if you don't tell me the dream that I had and the interpretation. I mean, that's pretty, a little bit edgy. So they freak out and say, no one can do this. No one's ever asked this. Come on, be reasonable. He says, all right, off with your heads. And so the execution order goes out. And the interesting thing in the story is that when the king calls for the wise people, he doesn't call for this guy called Daniel. But when the execution decree goes out, guess who's on the list? Daniel. Now, Daniel, he receives this, hey, buddy, we've got to, off with the head. And Daniel says, wait, what's the rush? What's the problem here? Because he wasn't privy to the problem that was happening in the king's bedroom. And so they explain to him in the story, hey, here's the deal. The king's had a dream. No one can tell him what he dreamt. He's freaked out and say, you're all dead. So Daniel says, wait. See, he remembered Bible study as a kid. And he remembered that in the Bible, the Old Testament at the time, it tells him that the secrets belong to God, and God reveals the secrets to his people through prophets. Now, again, you don't have to believe a single word of this story, like you didn't have to do it last night either. But this is what it says. So Daniel goes to the king and says, hey, listen, I know that the God of heaven can tell me what you dreamt and what it meant. Now, the king was a little bit more reasonable because he actually wants to know what the dream was and its interpretation because he believes it's a sign from who? The gods. So he says, you got one night. Talk about some pressure, right? You got one night. So Daniel in the story does what every atheist would do. He prays. I was on a plane. In fact, I was with my wife. We were flying I think it was Austria to, what's that country again? Anyway, Sofia's the airport. Bulgaria. We're flying on this plane, and we're coming in, and you could see, it was nighttime, you could see the Sofia airport here, and we're doing a turn, and we're going to come down, and all of a sudden, the plane just dropped. I don't know how far it dropped, but it dropped enough for everyone to freak out. And all of a sudden, people who were watching all the filth from Hollywood on the back of the TV screens, all of a sudden, that was all gone, and they're all doing the Hail Marys and the Orthodox prayers, and everyone's praying. Because the second you realize that there's a chance you're going to die, everyone turns to help. And that's what Daniel does. But Daniel has a custom of this. This wasn't some unusual behavior for him. But the remarkable thing is, in the story, Daniel claims, again, not my words, his words, he claims that God shows up and gives him the exact dream that Nebuchadnezzar has, the king. The exact dream. Now, when I read this for the first time, I thought, this is such an awesome fairy tale. It's so like, you expect this to happen to have a good ending. But Daniel claims that in his sleep that night after he prays and asks for help, he receives a dream. And in the dream, he sees an image of a man that has a golden head, silver chest, bronze waist, iron legs, and the feet, as you can't see there, are made of iron and clay. And then he watches it, and then a great big stone is cut out without any hands, which means no human was involved with it. And the stone comes down, hits the feet, and breaks the whole thing in pieces. That's what he dreamt. So he wakes up, and he says, hey, I got the answer to the king's dream. So it's funny, because the guy who's going to execute him previously in the story, he grabs Daniel when Daniel says, hey, I had the dream, I know what he dreamt. He drags him before the king, or brings him before the king, and he says to the king, hey, king, I found someone of the captives of the Hebrews who's able to interpret your dream. He takes the credit. It's very ironic. So Daniel shows up, and he tells the king, he says, King, this is what you dreamt. And as he's telling him what he dreamt, The king is like, that's it, that's it, that's it. This is incredible. The dream's coming back to me. This is, okay, great, but what does it mean? And so Daniel begins to give him an interpretation, which is the one thing that the king actually wanted. But the fact that this man, Daniel, claims that his God gave him a dream that he knows is his dream, he's shocked. So he's all ears, as we say. So Daniel begins, there it is. Daniel begins by telling him, listen, here's the deal. The God of heaven, who reveals the secrets to his servants, the prophets, is wanting you, King Nebuchadnezzar, to know what will happen in the latter days, or latter times, in the future, in other words. And what he wants you to know is that as you went to bed last night, the night before when you had the dream, you were thinking, I have this great kingdom, Babylon. What is going to happen to it in the future? And so the God of heaven, my God, Yahweh, he has given you the answer to your question. And Nebuchadnezzar's going, whoa, okay, what happens next? So Daniel begins and proceeds to tell him, this is what your dream means. And by the way, Daniel takes no credit for this. He claims that this comes from God. Now, you don't have to believe that. I don't have to believe that. That's the claim. But the fact that he claims this is a prophecy from God, remember last night? What is God's evidence for his claim? I will tell you the future before it happens, and that will prove the claim that I am God and there's no one else. So this is why we're studying this tonight. This is one of the 1,817 predictions. Because if this is wrong, we throw the book out, we go back to our happy little lives, or miserable lives, whatever the case your life is. But if this turns out to be solid, we've got another piece of evidence in a long string of evidence. So this is how he starts. Daniel turns to Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, and says, you are the head of gold. What's ironic with this, you know how last night we ended with that question? That global agenda's goal is to create a system whereby they receive allegiance and worship. Do you remember that? And they will do it through global economic control, and they'll do it through physical coercion. Remember that from last night? You know what's fascinating? We ended with the idea that there is constantly a challenge between religion and politics, church and state. Remember that? We looked at all examples. Remember a study of 21 civilizations in history? They found that every civilization has fallen because of religious or spiritual values. I want you to notice something. This golden head, Daniel just said, represents who? Nebuchadnezzar, who is king of Babylon, right? But here's the ironic thing. That means that gold represents what kind of power? Church power or religious power or political power? Which one? Political. But do you recognize that this is an image? And in Babylonian culture, images were religious objects. They were objects of devotion and worship. So what God has done in his dream is he's taken this point that this is actually a mixture of religion and politics here. And it's going to continue all the way down to the end. In fact, it will strengthen all the way. Let me ask you a question. Is gold softer or harder than silver? It's softer. So silver is stronger than gold. The next alloy is bronze or brass. Is brass stronger than silver? Yes. The next one is iron. We're moving down through time here. Iron. Is iron stronger than brass? Yes. And then the last thing is a mixture of iron and clay, and then the great big rock comes and destroys the whole picture. So it's showing that as we progress through time, there is going to be an intensity of this religious, political tension all the way down to the end. But in this dream, it starts with Nebuchadnezzar. It starts with Babylon. Now, Babylon, or the Babylon that Nebuchadnezzar was in charge of, was 605 or 606 BC. Starts here, and it continues down in time to the year 539 BC. We're still BC here. Probably more like here, to be honest. Now, the problem with this is that the head ends. It goes from gold to what? Silver. So something changes. Babylon doesn't last forever. And this was the question that was on his mind as he goes to bed that night. So what's ironic is that Babylon is depicted in this image that God is supposed to have sent through Daniel to Nebuchadnezzar as the golden empire. What's fascinating today is that we know from archaeological diggings that they found over 60 tons of gold from the temples that they excavated from in Babylon. This is in modern-day Iraq today. It was known as a golden empire, and so it was quite fitting that that was the symbol. But if you have ever gone to Iraq or even gone to Google Maps and typed in Babylon and zoomed in, guess what you find? A whole bunch of nothing. Babylon's gone. Nebuchadnezzar was looking for the eternal city of Babylon to endure forever and ever. But Babylon is gone. Something happened to it. Daniel continues in the next part of this interpretation. Says, but, you don't want to hear but if you're King Nebuchadnezzar. But after you shall arise, what does it say? Another kingdom, but it's inferior to yours. So we know that this is a kingdom story. We've got one kingdom, kingdom of Babylon. Now we have another kingdom, but it's inferior. Now, for whatever reason, Daniel doesn't have any more information on that. He doesn't tell him who it's going to be. He doesn't tell him how long or any of those things. He just says there's going to be a kingdom after you. Second kingdom, it's going to be inferior. Now, we saw last night in Daniel chapter 8, the name of that kingdom was Medo-Persia. Remember that from last night? Now, here's what happened. Babylon was glorious in all of its ways and days until the year 539 BC, when Babylon fell to the Medes and Persians. And what's ironic with this story is that if you go 700 BC, so Babylon was 600 BC, so go 100 years before Babylon exists, Nebuchadnezzar, there was a guy called Isaiah. Remember the big scroll in Jerusalem I mentioned last night, the scroll of Isaiah? Isaiah wrote 100 years before Babylon that there would be a man named Cyrus that God would send to conquer Babylon. You can go, this is 150 years before it happens. You can go to the British Museum and see the Cyrus cylinder, and on this cylinder, which is obviously by Cyrus, the guy who conquers Babylon, he writes, Cyrus says, I took Babylon without a fight. Because what happened was they were all partying inside a king. There was Nebuchadnezzar, then there was his son Nabonidus, and Nabonidus had a son called Belshazzar. Belshazzar was having a party because he was so, basically ego, and he was going, they're trying to get me from the outside, but our walls are impregnable, and we're going to have a party, we're going to thank the gods and all this good stuff. And that was the night that Babylon fell. And what Cyrus did was they dug the river Babylon the river Euphrates went through Babylon, the city, and they diverted the river upstream so the water level dropped. And as it dropped, it allowed them to walk in under the city walls, straight up into the city without being noticed, because they were all partying, walked right into the throne room and executed Belshazzar. And that was the night that Cyrus took control. The Medes and Persians took control. But it didn't stop there. So the Medes and Persians were this chest of silver. And they start in 539 BC, but they only continue down a few years to 331 BC. This is what it says. Daniel continues with the story, and he says, then another, a what kingdom? A third. So we had one was Babylon, two was Medo-Persia, and the third would be this bronze one. And notice what it says, it shall rule over the earth. Now, let me just qualify this, because in post-modern sort of era, we're kind of disconnected from the culture of the day. When we read that, we think the entire planet. But when this is spoken in their context, it was as far as you know that way, as far as you know that way, and as far as you know that way. So Medo-Persia is going to fall to a third kingdom, and that third kingdom is going to rule as far as we know. Now, do you remember from last night who that third kingdom was? Remember there was the ram and the goat? Who was the ram? Medo-Persia. Who was the goat? The Greeks. And who was that big horn? The first king, which was Alexander the Great. And so the rise of Greece is around 331 BC. Alexander decides to march east and start taking things east. He walks around, I said last night, into Jerusalem. He's going to take Jerusalem. He met those rabbis who presented that prophecy we saw last night with him in it. And he leaves them alone. He translates their text into the Greek language. We still use it to this day. He marches right past them, goes over, and he defeats the Medes and Persians. And that launched the Greek era, the Greek Empire. We call that the belly of the thighs, the waist and thighs. But Greece is still not around today. It's disappeared. Well, as in the empire. There's still a country of Greece, of course. From 331 BC down to, we know now, 168 BC. Something happened. And Daniel proceeds to tell King Nebuchadnezzar, here's what's happening next, buddy. And the what kingdom? I want you to know, this is very important. He counts them. There's the first, Babylon. There's the second. There's the third. And now we have the fourth. And the fourth shall be strong as iron. And last night we saw this in that prophecy in chapter 8, how after Greece disintegrates, after Alexander the Great, into those four general regions, there's fighting for 100 or so years, and eventually up comes a little horn that starts pushing in every direction, and it did those 8 things, remember from last night? And the end result of that was the rise of the Roman Empire in 168 BC. And Rome fulfilled all of those things that we talked about. And by the way, the Greeks are famous for their bronze armor, their bronze shields, and their bronze helmets. It's fascinating. In the British Museum, they have a actual discovery of a bronze helmet from the Greek times. What was God's symbol for the Greeks again? Bronze. And by the way, the Medo-Persians are the first civilization to use silver as the standard of currency. Before that, it was gold. And so each kingdom actually was connected to the symbol of metal that was used in this prophecy. Now, we would call this period now the Roman Empire, Imperial Rome. And it's interesting because when you get to this part, there's 2 legs, and there's an east and western part of the Roman Empire. Equally, with the chest, there is 2 arms, and there were 2 parts. There was the Medes and the Persians. So it's ironic that even the body parts seem to line up perfectly with the characteristics of the story. But Daniel's not done yet. Daniel continues with the interpretation, and this is where it gets interesting. Because remember how he referred to them? You are, number 1, then there will be second, then there will be a third, and then there will be a fourth. So which one's fourth? Rome. But then he continues and he changes. He says, the kingdom, which kingdom? What's the last one we talked about? The fourth, which was Rome, that kingdom shall be divided. Every other kingdom so far has been conquered. But the fourth one has to be divided because there is no fifth one in the story. Now think about the odds of predicting this. Yes, I could say, this island will be conquered by that power is going to be replaced by this power, and I could do that forever because I'm probably right. But it's interesting that it doesn't continue on that pattern. At some point, it's no longer conquering, now it is dividing. This is fascinating. By the way, this whole prophecy is 140 words. 140 words with this much information. It continues on with this idea that this iron empire, which we know to be Imperial Rome, it doesn't get conquered, it divides. And we enter into this time of the feet. The feet represent partly iron, which comes from which kingdom? From Rome. So that means Rome lives on in the feet, partially. But there's a new material introduced, and that's clay. So we have iron and clay now mixing together. Now, Rome, Imperial Rome, fell around 476. It took about 100 or so years for the fall to eventually happen. But eventually in 476, Rome ceases to be the Rome that we knew from the textbooks and from the movies, I guess. And we end up with what we call today Western Europe. Western Europe is a continuation of Rome, but in a fragmented sense. And in fact, Rome divides in Western Europe into 10 regions, which become 10 countries. Have you noticed how many toes are on feet? 10. The body parts match, the symbology matches, even the timing matches. No one conquered Rome. In fact, it's the biggest mystery of all history. How did Rome fall? There are literally hundreds of books written on the topic. So the king has this dream, which Daniel unpacks as there will be Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, Rome, and Rome will divide into what we would call today Western Europe. And this Western Europe period, this divided Rome, will continue until the end, because at the end, that's where the rock hits the feet. So let's put a timeline here from 600 BC all the way down through the ages past the BC AD point, and down here all the way down to today. Is there still the fragments of Europe in terms of Western Europe? 100%. It's still exactly the same thing. And that will continue until the end. It's fascinating. It continues on though and says, but King Nebuchadnezzar, this is Daniel speaking, as you saw the iron mixed with clay, they, the divided Roman Empire, this Western Europe, it says they will mingle with the seed of men, but they will not adhere one to what? They will not come back together, is the point. Just as iron can't mix with clay, these kingdoms cannot come back into one kingdom. And so the prediction is that divided Rome or Europe will never be united back into one empire again. Will never happen, according to the prediction. Now here's the ironic thing. Since Rome fell in 476 AD, all the way down to our time today in 2025, there have been numerous attempts to reunite Europe as one empire, directly contrary to what this prediction claims will happen. Here's a list of some of the people. Charlemagne, he tried to unite Europe. Charles V, Louis XIV, Napoleon. And what's that next name, everyone? Kaiser Wilhelm II. Hitler. And the latest attempt is the European, what's the next word? Union. Now, I want you to notice what Napoleon said. He said, there will be one Europe, one empire. There will be one currency. There will be one language, French. How's your French these days? And he says, and there will be one government over all of Europe. Napoleon's dream was to be emperor of Europe. But we all know that he had a great battle defeat, the Battle of Waterloo. And in his diary, it says this: God Almighty is too much for me. He recognized the fact that he can't do what he wants to do. Now we come back to Kaiser Wilhelm. He said, remove Daniel's head and replace it with mine. Why? Because Daniel's prophecy doesn't fit with my plans. What prophecy do you think Kaiser Wilhelm's referring to? The prophecy that Europe will never be reunited into one empire again. Don't you find that incredible? I mean, surely it's just a dusty old book from millennia past. If you want to make a united Europe, get a big army and go do it. They tried. He tried. Napoleon tried. But there was another guy that came after Kaiser Wilhelm. Do you remember him? Hitler. He said in one speech, there will be one people, one empire, and one leader. And I'm guessing he thinks that it would be him. But we have the advantage today that we can look back not too long ago and know that none of that turned out the way he expected. Because the prophecy says they will not adhere one to another. Do you know, I have stories in my library, books in my library of stories of people who studied the book of Daniel and lived during the time of Adolf Hitler. In fact, some of them were actually Germans. They were German Christians. And they were conscripted into fighting for Hitler and Hitler's army. And in one of the accounts that I've read, this Christian, he said to his general, or the general he was working under, he said, listen, my Bible says that Europe will never be united again. And so Hitler will fail in his attempt to unite Europe. He's going to lose the war. Now, that would be considered, take you out because you're committing treason. But the general said, well, give me some proof. He gave him the same study of this prophecy that we're doing tonight. The general was so convinced that this seems legit that they started rationing fuel. This is on the Russian front. They were rationing fuel so they would have storage enough to get into their vehicles to drive back after Hitler is defeated, because they didn't want to get facing the Russians. So they did that. It was about 3 or 4 months later that Hitler lost the war. They were able to get into their cars with their siphoned off fuel and be saved. And they the general's talking in the book about how it's all because this Christian believed the prophecy. It's phenomenal. There's another story that comes from the Egyptian front with the same war and the same Hitler in charge. It's absolutely fascinating. But the prophecy doesn't stop there. It says they're even going to try and unite, not just in war, but through marriage. This is what it says. It says they will mix with one another in marriage, but they will not hold together, just as iron does not mix with clay. If you go to Denmark today, there's a castle called Frederiksborg Castle. And inside this castle, there are great hallways with great tapestries, which was like the artwork of the day. And on these tapestries are all of the bloodlines and the marriage lines of all the royal families of all these countries in Europe, and how this one is married to this one, and this princess from here is married to that prince over there, and that king's from here and that. And it's, I'm sorry for my simplicity from Australia, but it's an absolute mess. That's how we ended up in England with a German queen. And a German king now, by descent, I mean. They're all cousins, they're all I was going to say inbred, but I won't say that. They're all interrelated. Because they thought, if we can marry off the princess from, say, for example, Austria, to the prince of France, then that will ensure we don't have war. And if we marry that one to that one, they clearly don't know how families work, right? It was just chaos. And so they tried to do it through marriage. The prophecy said they would, and it still says they will not adhere one to another, because there will be no fifth kingdom. We have lived since 476 AD to 2025 AD in a divided Europe. There's been numerous attempts to unite it, but every attempt has failed. And it says it will be this way until that rock comes, that stone, that last empire. And today's latest project, since the year 2000, it was a little bit before that they started officially, but the implementation of the euro dollar, for example, and some of the elections in Brussels and those things is really since the 2000s. And that's the European Union, or as they thought of calling it, the United States of Europe. The European Union. At the time when they were forming this idea of let's come together in a European Union, these are some of the language that the leaders were using in that time. This was the French president. He says, as this European Union idea is coming together, he says, a great power, singular, is being born. This, at the same time, this was the German chancellor, and he was quoted as saying, the course that we are setting with this European Union is irreversible. We will be a United States of Europe. The president of the European Commission, right up until the transition in the early 2000s, he said, we can and will succeed. I don't know how these guys don't study their history books. It's the same language. Every leader comes out with the same language. He says, we can and we will succeed in creating a unified, prosperous, democratic Europe where citizens can live in peace and freedom. Look, it sounds good, doesn't it? We don't want war. What's happening in Europe now is chaos, and it's horrible. We don't celebrate that. But the problem is that this prediction from almost 2,600 years ago says it's not going to happen. You are incapable of having peace on this planet because of greed, corruption, selfishness. And then, of course, it was all sort of chummy and united for about 15 years until Brexit. They said, the love affair is over. That's how the mainstream media was quoting it. And they divorced Europe. The divorce has been painful. I was in London last year and this year, and you walk around Parliament House, and they're still protesting about Brexit. Some of them want to come back. Some of them are saying, don't go back. It's a mess. It's an absolute mess. And if you're from Europe, I have pity on you. But the prophecy remains. There will be no fifth empire. Now, the statistics of predicting this version of attempt is insanely improbable. But Daniel isn't finished yet. He continues and he says, you watched while a stone was cut out without hands, which struck the image on its feet of iron and clay. That is divided Europe. That is the time since 476 AD. That is the time where they're trying to come together, but it fails and it fails and it fails. But you saw the image, King Nebuchadnezzar. You saw that image being struck by a great stone on its feet. And what did it do? It broke it into pieces. And remember, there's this picture of an idol, which is religious, and political states, which is state power, and the whole system is going to collapse. And then you will see the last empire. What happens is the stone hits the feet, wipes out this image. The image has a wind that comes and it blows it away like chaff into the distance. There's no trace of it. And then the rock that was cut out without hands, which is basically the way of saying no humans involved in this story. It's divine, it's supernatural. This supernatural event will intersect into human story, and it will set up a great mountain that will become a great mountain that will fill the whole world, and that is the last empire. This is the story that's told to the king. You've got to be pretty gutsy to tell the king, hey, it's all gloom and doom for you and the rest of your cronies. But there will be a last empire. Now, when you think about this, we have about 2,600 years of history given in 140 words, systematically going down from Babylon all the way down to our time. It's incredible. It's improbable. And as you saw in the last two presentations, we can break down this one prophecy, one of 1,817 prophecies. We can break it down into 7 predictive elements, which means 7 things have to happen for this one prophecy to be fulfilled. I mean, this is insanely complex. Here's the 7 components. We need Babylon to fall to Medo-Persia, Medo-Persia to fall to Greece, and Greece to fall to Rome. Then Rome can't fall, it can't be conquered, it needs to divide. And then we have to have not just the divided nations, but now we have to have many attempts to come together, but none of them are successful. And then the last thing we need to have is a great big stone which represents the last empire come and solve the problem. 7 things have to happen for one of 1,817 predictions to be fulfilled. If you line these up like a good analyst, you'll find that we have seen the first 6 fulfilled perfectly, haven't we? I mean, Babylon doesn't exist now. It fell, right? Medo-Persia fell, right? Greece fell, right? Rome fell, right? And Rome's been trying, or the Western Europe's been trying to unite for many, many centuries, hasn't it? And it's failed, right? So we are sitting with 6 fulfilled. But I got good news for you tonight. We haven't seen, well, it's not necessarily good depending which way you look at this, but the good news for you tonight is that this isn't done yet. Because if it was done, you'd be in trouble. Most of us. The good news is that we're waiting for the last piece of the puzzle, and the great news of that is this is a supernatural event. because it's a rock without hands cutting it out. That's what the language is here. So we are, here's BC, AD, here's 476, Rome falls, we've got Western Europe, all this division and trying to unite, and then here we'll call this the end. That's a nice way to end it with the flowers. Right there at the end is the rock that solves the problem, becomes the last empire, right there. Has that happened yet? Yes or no? You better get this answer right. No. So we're living in here, waiting for that, and there's a gap between us. Is that clear? Now, in the next presentation, I'm going to talk about the gap. What's happening in the gap? We want to know what's happening in the gap. We know the past. We don't care about the past. The past is ancient history. But what happens in the gap? I'm so glad you're passionate about this. We're going to answer that question after the break. So, here in conclusion for this section, what Daniel chapter 2 has done for us has given us a great timeline from the past, connecting us to the present, and just jumping us into the future. It's the great timeline. Every other prediction in the Bible fits somewhere in those timelines. It's incredible. It's amazing. But once again, I want to suggest to you, this is either a hoax. Somebody completely managed to hoodwink us and convince us that somehow this is all legit, but it's completely fake. That's one option you have tonight. You're going to see very quickly, you're running out of options here. The other option is, if it's not a hoax, what's the option? It's supernatural. Maybe, just maybe, that Daniel wasn't a nut job. Maybe, just maybe, he actually did have a prediction given to him from his God. And maybe, just maybe, all this stuff that he claims is from the divine source is legit. And if that's true, we better start paying attention to this big black book. So we've seen some examples. We haven't exhausted this. We've seen examples of historically accurate records in this book. And we've seen a proven track record in this book so far. It's phenomenal. And so what that means is, for me tonight, for you tonight, what this means is that the God of Daniel knows the future. That's the conclusion of the story from Daniel's perspective. His God knows the future. But what the implication, if he knows the future, the implication is this, and this is what affects you tonight. If he knows the future, what's the implication? He knows my future. He knows your future. Remember last night we ended with, I didn't tell you this stuff to scare your pants off. I told you because I want you to know you have a future that's filled with hope. So where are we going next? We're going out there to have a break. When we come back, we're going to look at our second presentation, which is Global Prophetic Warnings. How near is what? Remember we said we're standing right here on the threshold. There's that last empire. How near is this? For real? Do we know? Come back after the break.